They want to make this thing successful. Yeah, that can get, swept up in passion, and we all are blinded by our own bias, right? Like, I'm going to fall in love with my own idea. Well, that's a very dangerous thing. And we see entrepreneurs do this every day, and investors see it all the time, right? And we know how that ends, right? It's very painful. When you have the studio, they go, oh, no. Let's not do that. Let's fix that. Let's have those difficult conversations. But that's who I would want to build a company with.
Welcome to the show. Great to have you on. I'm super excited to dive into this, but who is Matt? Let's start at that, right? For people who aren't familiar with you and what you're doing, kind of give us the elevator pitch.
Serial entrepreneur. I've been in corporate innovation for a long time as well, so I've gotten to see kind of both sides of the equation. I've raised venture funding before. I think I got exposed to studios for the first time maybe 11 or 12 years ago. And it was kind of like that seed that just keeps on growing and expanding and eventually takes over everything. About 4 years ago, I want to say, studios became my major focus in life. And at this point, I've probably talked to about 400 plus studios all over the world. I've seen so many.
And let's even define startup studio, define venture studio, define what this word is.
Yeah.
It's somewhat of a new concept. And I think there's also, I want to look at the macro side too, because I think that a lot of the startup world has been breaking down from the traditional venture capital model, and it's been opening up into multiple areas. So first of all, what is a startup studio? What is a venture studio in your own words?
Sure. So there's a lot of ways to define it. There's like a half a dozen different terms out there. For me, they're all the same thing. A studio is an organization that is designed to build other companies. That's it. Now, this means that they're playing the role of a founder, an entrepreneur, right? They're playing the role of an investor. They're bringing a skill set and helping to operationalize this company. So they're doing a lot of work. Their business model is not based on services, at least for the studio portion of this activity. It's based on creating value in the companies that they're making. And eventually that will either be, paid back to the studio, either in the form of an exit or through distributions. So it is about creating companies. Doesn't matter what kind of company.
Company that creates companies.
It's a company that creates companies. Like the original, where the term studio came from was film studios, right? Same kind of concept. Let's bring writers, producers, the special, like everybody that we need to make a movie or TV show together in one entity. And let's make not one, but 5 or 10 or more. And we're going to learn from each other. We're going to improve the odds of success. And this is just going to work a lot better. And it does.
So if I maybe steal me on the other side, maybe the venture capitalist argument or the traditional industry, most of them would say, well, that doesn't work. You need to have people that are very dedicated. And if you have this kind of entity that's focused on multiple split focuses, it's too diversified. It's not going to work. Like, how do you kind of push back against that idea of you need to have founders that are extremely passionate and they're going to die for this vision, for this idea, and they're the ones creating and building the company entirely with, yes, venture capitalists maybe providing some support, but this whole studio concept, it's gonna fail.
There's a couple things in there to unpack. I'm trying to remember how I dealt with one of these in the past because I had a great approach to it. I think we've all experienced like the only proper founder to run a company is somebody who's willing to basically die to make this company real, right? They're willing to sacrifice everything in their life. That doesn't make a lot of sense because if they're willing to sacrifice everything in their life for this company, they're willing to sacrifice all of your money too. If you're willing, if your requirement is they got to sacrifice their potential for career, like they got to burn the bridges behind them, right? We've heard that one a bunch. That means they're willing to sacrifice their family. If they're willing to sacrifice their family, your investment has no value. Why would you trust them with your investment?
So you want the right amount of crazy and conviction, but not so much that they're putting the business and the idea ahead of you.
That's right. Like, let's be real here, right? It's never one thing. It's always a combination of things. And you find, I think today, a lot of folks that wish they were an entrepreneur. They couldn't start that way, or they didn't start that way. They found out later in life that they really wanted to go do that. And they got a problem now. They've got obligations in life. They've got a mortgage. They've got, they have to have health insurance. They've got family. Like, now, how do they go start a company? And that's where an environment like a studio starts to make a lot more sense. Because one, you spent your life at that point maybe learning some great skills in a corporate environment or working in a lot of different startups, but you haven't been that founder. You don't have that entrepreneurial skill set. So you've got to go learn it. That's kind of dangerous. That's high risk. Why don't you go work with a bunch of folks that know how to do that really early stuff and do it well? But you're going to, work on your idea. And there's an interesting, everybody wants to find founder fit. Founder fit can also be manufactured in some ways. One of the big things is if the founder is not going and doing customer discovery and talking to customers, talking to users, they're never really going to fall in love with what they're doing. And it's not sustainable. But if they're talking to them, they see the pain, they see the problem, they see the value that they can add, and that helps create the passion. So one of the things when I look at a studio is like, when are you bringing that entrepreneur in? Because it really changes the dynamic of who you're looking for and how you're going to operationalize this thing. If you're bringing them in early, like, we've got a couple ideas, but we're not sure what we're going to do yet, then we're going to co-create together. And the odds of that entrepreneur falling in love with this are very, very high because they get to influence how it's going to form and shape, which is a key component of falling in love with it. But also they get to see the value of what they're going to go create. If you've done, as the studio, all the validation, like, hey, this is the thing to go execute, how are you going to come in and fall in love with it? Like, you didn't get to shape it. You haven't really seen this problem. You don't know, why people care about it. That's a lot harder to pull off. It still can be done, but it's very, very difficult. But getting back to like your original question, I think part of the challenge that investors see with the studio model is they're coming at it from an investment angle. A studio is not. It is an entrepreneurial angle plus an investor angle. And that's a fundamental shift, right? Investors are already generally looking at what they can invest in, right? There's something there. There's a team, there's a product, there's a good concept at a bare minimum. And usually there's customers. Like, there's something there that they're backing. Studio doesn't have that. It has to create it. So in the venture capital world,
and if I can,
yeah.
If I can ask, is that because the investors invest in the studio and then the studio deploys the capital to the individual companies and then eventually brings in the entrepreneur? So the investors kind of investing in the concept and the thesis of that studio first and not necessarily specific companies?
So a couple different pieces there. The VC, the venture capitalist, they're going to invest in, a company. If you're investing in a studio, then yes, what you're really doing is you're backing that team, the process, the track record that they have. If it's a new studio, it's probably a track record of operating and building other companies, but not operating as a studio yet. And so that's definitely a big challenge. But the studio fundamentally creates deals. A venture capitalist looks for deal flow. So if you're creating deals, you have to do two things. You have to find the right founder to bring in. You have to find the right opportunity and make sure they all match together. If you're a venture capitalist and a professional investor, I need as many deals coming in so I can sort through and see which one is the best. But the best is already a combination of a founding team and an opportunity that they're pursuing. So it's a very different approach and way to look at this whole process.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And I guess, so two macro questions, then we can get kind of into the specifics. So the first macro question is, why now? Right? So why, venture capital has been around since the 60s, if not before. And only in maybe the past, I feel like, year or two has startup studio become a lot more of a popular term. It's been around for a decade or more, and I've seen different models work. But so why now? And then the second thing I want to get into is like you specifically, kind of how you are helping craft companies that build companies and just kind of keep going in the food chain. But first, let's start with why now? Why is the market kind of really pushing and we're seeing a lot more of these startup studios pop up?
I think it's a lot of things that kind of happen almost at the same time. Like when I first started talking about studios on social media, I was surprised that not many people were. Like the modern version of a studio started in about 96 with Idea Labs. But that's 96. Like I started posting on LinkedIn, I think in 22, August of 22. Like that's a huge gap where there were not a lot of voices out there. There are a few, but it definitely hadn't really caught on. And I think it was a couple things. We had some reports come out that showed the performance of studios. And the performance numbers were such that if you just see them on their face, you're like, is that real? Because that's too good. What's going on?
Can you quote anything off the top of your head or mention anything?
53% IRR. Now, to put that in perspective, a top quartile venture fund is like 23, 26, right? So we're talking, double the performance of venture. Well, that's wild. The average success rate of a studio going from idea to Series A is 60%. That beats Y Combinator, right? And they're not going from idea. You came in with something to Series A. I think it was either 39 or 45%. It's fantastic numbers, right? But when you're talking about the top accelerator in the world performing at that level and the average studio outperforming it, that gets interesting. Now, the challenge studios have is the data set is incredibly limited, right? It's minuscule. It's by its nature, right? We only had a few studios that started in the 90s. How many of them have survived? Like the studio model is growing. We've got 800 plus, I think, active today. But just like venture, it takes a decade to show returns from that first cohort. So your data lags tremendously. So that's a big challenge. But, as the studio model performance numbers were starting to come out and people were starting to look at this in the entrepreneurial and venture world, we also had some shifts in just the venture world, right? Valuations were skyrocketing. Money was effectively free and this was all happening. And then it stopped. And as it started stopping, that's when I think we saw a massive spike in interest because people were suddenly like, fundamentals matter. And when you look at a studio, their focus is getting this company to exit. That means it must be successful by definition, which means we have to design it to be successful from day one. So if it's not going to be successful, let's kill it now. And there's a lot of ways you can define that. We've been in the entrepreneurial world a long time. There's a lot of things that'll kill a company. The challenge is if you're that entrepreneur, you don't have the bandwidth to even look at most of them. And you're not going to see them and you won't recognize them most of the time anyway. The studio is a little bit more objective, right? They can step back. There's a lot more people looking at the problem as well and say, this doesn't make sense, right? It could be like, there aren't any potential acquirers for this, or there's only one. So this is not a good thing to go build because if that acquirer strategy changes, there's no exit. So that's bad. Maybe investors already put a ton of money in this space and you're not going to be able to raise money. That's bad. Maybe we know that actually finding these customers, acquiring these customers doesn't work well. Like no one's been able to crack this. This is not a good place to put our efforts. We need to find a different opportunity to pursue. So there's a lot of things that a studio can do, effectively playing Overwatch, right? Making sure that the terrain you're going to walk down as that founder is safe. Like guide you around these obstacles. Like everyone knows this cliff exists. Don't go over the cliff.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting shift because you look at traditional startups and the entrepreneurs need it to work.
Oh, yeah.
So yes, they consider pivots, but they need to have, this is their one and this is their all. I mean, most entrepreneurs put numerous years in, and sometimes personal money, like their reputation's at stake. And because they're so tied up into it, and you see often this kind of coupling of ego and identity along with entrepreneur and company, it feels like a massive failure if you are to kind of say, hey, this space doesn't work anymore, or the funds aren't there, or I need to fundamentally shift or restructure, or this is not a good company. But when you shift the paradigm to say, hey, this is a thing that's being incubated from this company, from the studio, we're the ones that are kind of driving it forward. Yes, we want you in. Yes, we want to incentivize you. Yes, we want you to be the CEO or the one of the founders or whatever you call it. But we're the ones kind of guiding the ship. It can be less personal because it's being driven by an entity rather than an individual.
Well, beyond that, look at the studio as an ideal co-founder in a lot of ways. Your ideal co-founder should be able to pull you aside and go, this is not going to work. How do we make this work? How do we fix it? And the right fix is like, let's go build a company that's going to work, that has a chance of success, that isn't going down a path that we've seen hundreds go before and is doomed to fail. That's an incredibly valuable conversation to have, right? You usually cannot have that because one, the other co-founder is right there alongside you and doesn't have that perspective. But there's kind of an interesting role that studios also play in that, in the startup world, like that first major entity you often get involved in is an accelerator. Let's go faster. A lot of the studios I talk to are like, no. Let's go slower. Let's stop. Is this the right thing to go build? And I was talking to Platform Studios for a podcast that we're launching here soon. And they take, 6 weeks, 8 weeks in the very beginning. You will not build. You will stop. You will slow down. You will understand the ecosystem that you're planning to enter. And, if we look back at all the other entities in the startup world, like who's actually suggesting something like that take place? Like that is absolutely the right thing you should do before you like, hey, I'm going to spend 7 years of my life or more in this space. Figure out if it's the right one to be in. Like take a beat. Because
I think
we all start down that
so
path,
much
and they're
focus.
like, "Oh, well, if we had known, we would have gone this way instead."
Yeah. I mean, often you see this kind of blending of emotion with business in entrepreneurship. It seems exciting, it's fun, it's fast paced, and what do you always hear? You hear about passion, right? You should have passion for the problem you're solving. You need to be passionate. And so, I mean, passion. If you look at passion and you talk about like lovers, like passion also makes you go crazy. You do stupid things. And so, when you're talking about money and building a company, yes, you want to have motivation to keep going and work on the problem you're doing. But this kind of passion, you also want to make sure that you're selecting the right thing. You're not kind of blinded by love, blinded by idealism, blinded by whatever. You want to go in, understand the market, understand what your pathway is, understand why you're doing this problem, not just because you care about it. You should care about it. You want to keep going with it. But that shouldn't be the only criteria as to why you're solving this problem. It should also be a logical, research-based decision of this is a problem that we have a strong conviction in can actually turn into a business, a return, a whatever we're after for the collective parties that are entering to build this company.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you talk to the vast majority of founders out there, one of the things that they want to get out of starting this company is a nice exit, right? They want to get paid along the way. They want to make this thing successful. Yeah, that can get, swept up in passion and we all are blinded by our own bias, right? Like I'm going to fall in love with my own idea. Well, that's a very dangerous thing. And we see entrepreneurs do this every day and investors see it all the time, right? Like the founder's not listening to investors, to their customers, to anybody. And they're just like blindly, no. The customer will figure out that we're right. That's not really how it works. And we know how that ends, right? It's very painful. When you have the studio, they go, oh, no. Let's not do that. Let's fix that. Let's have those difficult conversations. But that's who I would want to build a company with.
Yeah.
Right? Don't just go blindly over the cliff of passion. No, let's build something that's valuable. It's got to have an impact. Otherwise, why am I committing, a decade of my life here.
So I want to shift to my second question now, which is more around you. So we talked about a studio is an entity, a company that builds companies, right? And then Matt Burris is the man who helps build studios that build companies. So talk a bit about, I mean, you mentioned, I forget if it was before we started recording or not, but you've helped and talked to so many different studios. What is kind of your meta process, your thesis around this is what a good studio is, this is what a bad studio is? You talked about kind of the three different stakeholders. Like, talk a bit about the construct of a good studio.
So I see. I think at the end of 22 on LinkedIn, I went viral. 1.5 million views on one post about studios. And off of that, I had like 500 DMs. And a lot of those were other studios, people looking at doing studios saying, hey, can you give me a little advice? I really want to understand how to do this better, do that better. And so that kind of led me down the path of consulting, but also designing a framework for people to understand, is their studio design sound? And one of the core frameworks I use for this is every studio has 4 customers. You can't get away from them. You got to serve all of them, which makes this very unique from a business perspective. You've got the investors in the studio. You've got the staff that work in the studio and the founders of that studio. You've got the entrepreneurs that you're going to partner with, and you've got follow-on capital. Now, I specifically say follow-on capital and not venture capital, because follow-on capital could be anything. It could be debt. It could be revenue-based financing. Like, there's so many ways to finance a business. It doesn't just have to be venture. But as you're building a studio and designing it, you get to pick every single one of these, right? Am I going to work as for investors? Is it going to be angel investors, family offices, institutionals? The deals that work for each one of those are very different. It impacts your operations, your legal structure, a lot of different aspects of your studio. The staff and the founders, well, how's the studio going to work and serve them as well? The staff is joining because they want to work on like awesome stuff, but also get paid. And have potential upside in all the companies they're building, and you do too as the founder of the studio. But it's also passion, right? You're building a studio that's going to build other companies. You're probably going to operate this thing, if it's successful, for 20 plus years. That had better be aligned with what you enjoy in life, because otherwise, a few years in, you're gone, because this is not resonating with who you are. So you've got to understand that aspect. The founders that you're going to partner with, now it's about like, what is the deal structure? Who are you going to be working with? Like, how is this going to come together? And all of that kind of plays into the follow-on. Because one of the biggest ways I see studios kind of mess up is they create a deal structure. They can get the founder that they're looking to work with to say yes. Right? I can go to somebody in corporate America and say, hey, I'm going to give you salary and health insurance for 18 months. Let's go build a company together. I'm going to give you 15% equity in the company. Well, from the startup world, that deal sounds horrible. Like that's completely out of whack, right? But from the corporate world, you're not going to get even 0.1% equity, even if you're all the way up at the CEO, unless you were a founding CEO. So if somebody comes in and says, I'll give you 15%, that is unheard of. That's huge. And you're going to give me salary? Like, there's no downside to saying yes to this deal when you're coming from that world. And now you've created a really interesting problem, right? You've taken potentially the lion's share of equity as a studio, so exits look phenomenal, and your investors are like, I love this. These numbers look great. And then you get to the follow-on. And if you're looking to have venture capitalists invest in the companies you build, they're going to look at this and go, there's nothing left for the founder. I'm out. I won't touch this deal.
Specifically, the founder is not going to be incentivized enough to keep going with this with a couple subsequent rounds.
Exactly. And all right, that makes sense. Well, what if you're not going for venture though? What if it's debt financing? What if it's different? Like, it can work. But because the studio can build companies in so many different ways, Like one of the ways I've seen work is a studio will go acquire a company. All right, now we're not in the world of venture capital at all, right? How big is this company? What is the EBITDA? What's the revenue? Like, what's the profit? Like, oh my God, you've got something here. Now the studio almost looks more like a private equity company or a search fund where you go in, improve the baseline operations of the company, maybe build a new product roadmap out. You start improving where this thing is going to go and how you're going to expand it. The person you bring on to run it might look a lot more like a CEO rather than an entrepreneurial founder. And now the deal structure starts changing drastically. Their expectations change drastically. Your comparables change. And this is usually where I go when I'm looking at how do you formulate and look at a deal structure for a studio that's really going to work. What's your comparable, right? If you're comparing yourself and the deal will be compared to other venture-backed startups, well, it's got to fit that mold, right? Founder equity has to align with reality, you know. If you're not, and your comparable is a private equity deal, search fund deal, or something very different, well, go with the comparable, right? And that gives the studio a lot of freedom, but it layers on a lot of complexity, right? Because people will hear studio and go, oh, well, you do it this way. Like, we don't. You know, we don't partner with outside folks potentially. Like, we go acquire them instead. So there's a lot of ways to kind of bring this model together. And kind of the, you know, I built a cap table simulation model because the cap table and the deal structure for studios is one of the most hotly debated topics out there, with good reason. And
it probably changes depending on what your thesis and your approach and how you're thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Like
and like, what kind of support is the studio bringing, right? If the studio is there for 3 months, which is like an accelerator, well, that equity deal has to look very, very different than the studio who is there building alongside you for 18 months and brings a full team to bear building that company. That's a very different proposal. So the model that I built allows you to put in, you know, basically any cap table you want, and it can simulate now out to the Series E. So I pulled off, you know, Carta's typical data for dilution at every round, put it in there. The interesting thing when I did this model was if the studio takes half of the common stock at formation and the founder, the entrepreneur partnering with, takes the other half, well, this can work out really well for that founder. They might end up with more equity than they would have, 20% more than if they went the normal route. But this assumes one big thing, that the studio fully replaced the need for a co-founder on the cap table. That's really the promise of a studio, is you don't need as many co-founders anymore. And let's be honest, often when we go out there and want to go start a company, the people we're thinking of co-founding it with are not the right people long term. They're the people that we know. It's hard to scale up as the
company needs to grow.
Yeah. They're convenient, right? I'm going to build a SaaS company. I don't know how to program. Well, I need somebody that knows how to program. So my neighbor down the street happens to know, like, I've known him for years, like, let's go do this. That's not ideal. Like, that might be how you start, and that's how a lot of companies start, but that is definitely not ideal. When you work with a studio, you can go, you're going to replace the need for that co-founder. You might replace the need for another co-founder as well. So when the studio is doing its job and really replacing the need for a co-founder on the cap table, giving them a co-founder share starts to make a lot of sense. And the other ways that the studio starts optimizing dilution, really reducing dilution, is they'll do things like they'll put an options pool in day one, and they'll be hit by that options pool as well. So the studio takes dilution. The studio often makes the first capital investment in the company. They'll take preferred equity for that, generally. But it dilutes their common share as well. But you're skipping your friends and family round. You're skipping your angel round. You're skipping an accelerator. You often skip the pre-seed and go directly to seed. Some studios take you all the way to Series A, if you're in that venture track style. That gets interesting, because one of the things I love to see online all the time is people like, this is what the cap table looks like at Series A. And like, there's no options pool. The options pool is 15, 20%. And if you didn't have it set up, your seed or Series A investor is going to go, you need to set up an options pool, and that needs to be set up before I invest. And so you're looking at, a 20% dilution from that investment, except it's actually a 40% dilution because you got to set up the options pool. And that's one of those things that kind of gets glossed over. But when you look at all the real details there, suddenly things start looking a lot more favorably in the studio model, because they're like, no. If we set the options pool up day one, your initial hires come out of the options pool. They don't come out off of your equity. Not only that, in the studio, you don't have to hire your early team. We are your early team. They don't get any extra equity for that. So a lot of your early sources of dilution can kind of go away. And so that's how you can actually end up with more ownership in your own company if you partner with a studio. Now, not all studios do this. So this is an area that you really need to evaluate if you're a founder going to go partner with a studio. Does this deal make sense? If I went the other routes I'm considering, where would I land? Is the deal that I'm being presented with, both the actual equity deal, but also the value and support the studio is bringing, does it justify this to me?
So pull on that thread a little bit. There, you talked about the 4 different customers, 4 different stakeholders that are kind of involved in the studio ecosystem. We have the entrepreneur, we have the studio themselves, we have the investors, and then we have follow-on investors. And really with the entrepreneur, you also have kind of the employees as well as the entrepreneur. So if and actually I want to throw a 5th one in there. It's not necessarily one of the customers, but the employees of the studio itself, right? That's kind of another person kind of in the mix here. So if I were to be any one of these entities, these parties within this kind of transaction, what should I look for? I mean, you've evaluated tons of different startup studios. You've probably seen what works well, what doesn't work well. I'm sure you have some ideas. But if I'm an entrepreneur, how do I go about evaluating a startup studio to join or not join? This one's good, this one's bad, this one's, I should even do it, or I should just go the traditional route. And then kind of on down the line, like, oh, I'm really good at my skill. I've been doing finance for a while. Maybe I want to go join a startup studio because then I can have some exposure to equity, but I still get a salary. Just kind of like break it down, all these different roles. How would you evaluate a startup studio to say, like, this is a good decision, this is a bad decision? They know what they're doing, they don't know what they're doing.
I think one of the things would be for me to understand, how are they approaching this with all the customers, right? Because if you understand how they're aligning with everybody, you can kind of get a sense for, have they designed a studio that's stable? Is it going to run into any problems later? Like, ignore the promise, ignore the vision. Let's look at the operational reality for a second, right? Unit economics. How does it work? Does it work for everybody? If it doesn't, we're going to be making some changes, right? They'll be dictated. The market will force it to happen. And that's usually painful, right? Going back to those investors going, yeah, the returns we promised, we can't deliver because we got to change all of our deal structures. Like, that's a survivable conversation, but it's not a good one to have.
Yeah, ideally, you don't need to survive that conversation.
A lot of studios do not survive that conversation.
Yeah.
But beyond that, if I'm looking at a studio as a founder, there's a few easy, quick elimination things I look at. What style of founder is the studio playing? Is the studio the founder? They go find the opportunity, validate it, and then look for somebody like me to partner with. All right, that's one. Like, maybe that's a fit for me, maybe it's not. Is the studio a co-founder? We're going to partner together at or around the idea stage and go build this thing from scratch. Is the studio a late co-founder? Like, do I need to bring my company minimum viable product, like some level of validation to them, and now they back it? Or is it a refounder where they're going to license some IP or acquire a company and build on top of that using that foundation? Based on where they are, like what kind of founder role they play, and what I'm looking for, I can know, like, is there even a way to collaborate? Because there might not be. And that happens. Yeah. And the challenge is, it's really hard to see that from the outside. There's no database today where you can go search like, hey, Is this a studio I can really collaborate with based on what I want to do and how I want to work? So that's one thing I quickly look at. Obviously, other things like, is it in the right industry? Geography, is it nearby? Is it virtual? Do they have a hybrid approach? Because a lot of studios like, no, you will physically be here. So can I move? Because if I can't, like, that's an easy no. So there's a few things like that. After that, it really gets down to like, I want to know how they're going to support me. What's this process really look like? How do I get some support along the way? What's that transition going to look like? I definitely want to talk to folks that have gone through this studio before. All studios evolve, but if I talk to a couple of founders that have gone through their process and their program, that's going to tell me a lot. And if it's a fit for me, just like, an entrepreneur should understand if that opportunity is a fit for them, you should understand if you're a fit for that studio, because every studio has a very different company creation approach. And how you want to go build and how you are as a person might not fit that studio. So that's a big thing to look at, because that's a long-term partner.
Make sure you get that one right.
Right? Get that one right, yeah. Divorce is hard and painful,
Yes.
and you don't want to do it. So yeah, definitely take that look. And I would take a very, very similar approach if I was looking to hire on as staff. How does the studio really approach doing this kind of work? What's my involvement? Do I get to work on just one project at a time, or am I working on more than one? Can I influence the process? Or we're like, no, we're just going to go do this. It depends.
And are there things that this employee should look for as red flags, green flags of, oh, well, if they're putting people on more than one project, then it's too disparate focus and it's probably not going to be successful? Or is it really just like, let me find the studio that works best for me, and all of these approaches can work? It's just about kind of what I'm most interested in.
It's more the second, but while all approaches can work, not all combinations of approaches can, right? So there is, I think, a really big temptation for studios to build lots and lots of companies and provide little support to all of them, because that gets you diversification. That's really counter to the fundamental approach of a studio model, which is concentrated, deep support. So when you start seeing a studio move to like, we're doing really, really high volume, you start seeing the studio move away from delivering a lot of the core values that the studio can deliver. You're not providing a lot of hands-on support, right? If I look at an accelerator, it's been a while since I did the math, but it's, at most maybe 20 man hours a week, person hours a week of support into that company, right? It's not a lot. And that's at best. Most accelerators, they've got a handful of folks that are working. You've got a program you're doing. There's a couple of check-ins, and there's a few advisors there that are not really part of the team, but just helping the accelerator out. That's not a lot of support. A studio should be like, no. We provide at least 2 full-time people or more. Somewhere in that level. Now you're like, okay, that's a radically different proposition. But often that's going to be, those studio teams are going to be working on more than one project simultaneously. If you look at a team, say, focused on, sales. Okay. If you're all selling in the B2B SaaS space, you can support multiple companies, just like if it was a B2B SaaS sales agency doing consulting support to startups. You can support more than one startup at the same time and do it well. There is a limit, right? But I wouldn't be too concerned if you're going to work on more than one. If you're approaching like, hey, no, you're going to support 5-10 companies a day, it's like, that there's no way that's going to work well. Right? Just no, please.
Have some common sense as to how spread thin people can be, and look for, again, things that kind of make sense of, well, if you're across 16 different industries and investing in or starting 20 companies a year, it sounds like you're taking on a little too much there.
Absolutely. And to that point, focus in a studio is very, very valuable. There's a great temptation not to focus because we're just building companies, right? Let's do anything in like the B2B space. But the more focused you become as a studio, the easier it is to build a great playbook in that space, right? If I'm in InsurTech, okay, all the technology I build, well, might end up touching, say, HIPAA compliance stuff. Because health insurance, so I might need to know, like every company we build is going to have a very similar tech stack, very similar regulatory rules that they have to, adhere to. Interesting. So let me build that skill set up to build that kind of company and that kind of tech stack really well. Sales. If I'm always targeting, enterprise B2B is very different than small and mid-sized business B2B. All right, I can build a playbook that way. If it's in a specific industry, I can build a strong network in that industry and really accelerate building any company in that space. But if I'm a new studio especially, and I'm going to go after 4 or 5 different industries, how am I building that network up? Right? You just start getting spread way too thin. There are always exceptions. Like one exception are the founders that you're going to partner with, are you screening them, making sure they're bringing that in? Right? If they bring in that level of network, okay, you don't have to deliver it.
There's fundamentals from that side, right? Of just like, yes, there are exceptions, but they're probably best practices of like looking at the startup studio, the venture studio, whatever you want to call it, the studio, right? And saying, do I think this is going to work or not? Is it going to be successful or not? And kind of just looking at the team, the backing, their thesis, their approach, how they're bringing in the entrepreneurs, how far they're carrying them through. I think there's a little bit of a different criteria if you're looking at it from an investor lens of saying, okay, I'm going to put dollars into this. Yes, I want to make sure that they build good companies, they're finding the right founders, they have a good support team, all of that, sure. But what does the economic, and I mean, I want a 56% IRR, right? So how do I find another studio that is going to perform well? And where does kind of the math, the numbers come into play on that due diligence?
So there's a couple things to unpack in that one. Studios typically have a much larger equity stake in the companies that they create than venture capitalists are going to have when they make an investment. So the GSSN numbers, I think, were average 32 or 34% stake in portfolio companies. That might not include, though, the preferred stake that the studio also takes. Now, the challenge from an investment angle is what portion of that is going to come back to me as the investor? Because unlike a venture fund, which there's a very typical 2 and 20 fund structure, and all of it is basically going to get shared on that, hey, GP, venture fund folks, you guys get 20% of the returns. I'm going to take 80 as the LP, but all of the equity that you get in from an investment is in that fund. All returns are going to go back and be split across that carry structure. In a studio, that might not happen the same way. And so that's what makes the due diligence around a studio a lot more complex. So there's 3 typical legal structures that a studio will use: your traditional venture fund 2 and 20 structure, a holding company, which doesn't have carriage. It's like, hey, we're going to put money into this company. We're going to go build a cohort of companies, but the ownership in this holding company is what determines our split. Minus if you do preferred stakes and all that. Then there's the dual entity, and that combines both. So what you will often see is that the studio operating company is structured more as a holding company, and they're across, in the end, when a studio is kind of stabilized, multiple funds. So we're going to raise a fund to build this cohort. Then we finish building this cohort, we're going to raise another fund, but the studio still stayed there. If you have investors in this entity, now how does the returns get handled? And it varies. So I don't think we want to dive into the really, really deep math there. We can. I'm actually building a very complex financial model right now to look at 4 different legal structures, 4 different company creation approaches across 4 different investment fund vehicles so that studios can understand how their design choice impact investor returns, and investors can kind of see how this plays out as well. Because one of the most common questions that investors ask studios once they're in that due diligence is, so what happens when the next investors come in? Am I going to get diluted? Are my returns going to get impacted? Because you might not get diluted, but your returns could still get impacted.
And that can be the next investor for both companies in cohort 1 or into the venture studio itself.
Right. So, if you're that holding company, you built your first 10 companies. Well, you're going to raise again. Where are you going to raise into? Are you going to raise into this holding company? Well, those investors are like, we already built these 10. Like, are we going to change the valuation? Like, what's going on? Because their ownership's getting impacted, right? Are you going to create a new holding company, which does happen, and now it's independent? Like, these investors are not impacted, but they're not gaining anything in this new holding company. Is it a fund where the fund shows up? The fund will often pay the studio to build companies. They're not investing in the studio, so they don't take ownership in the studio, but they pay the studio to build companies. In return, they get a piece of that equity that the studio takes. So those investors in that original holding company, their ownership isn't impacted. They're not diluted, but they don't get the same returns. But they didn't fund the next cohort.
Is there a preferred, like if you were investing in 10 different startup studios, kind of fund of funds, is there a preferred structure that you would look for? Or is it really just making sure you understand it, making sure how you're impacted long term, and all these structures can work? It just comes down to how that particular studio wants to operate and making sure that they've thought through the steps, they've thought through what the path to capital return is, and making sure you're either being diluted and it's clearly communicated, or you're not being diluted, or whatever it is. There's a clear plan and we're all on board.
So if I'm an investor, it depends on what investor I am. The reason I say that is if you're an institutional investor, you are typically looking to exit your full investment in 10, 12 years, the fund life, right? But if you invest in a studio holding company that's a permanent holding company, there is no exit. You're just going to take distributions forever. Like the studio is not designed to be sold. You can manufacture one, a secondary exit, but that's not the goal. And so that might not fit if I'm an institutional investor. But if I'm a family office and I'm looking at long-term wealth creation, that's a phenomenal opportunity, right? Because, it's a permanent holding company. I'm going to invest, and you guys are going to go raise a fund to build the next cohort of companies, and I get to participate in that next cohort, but I didn't put money in. And you're going to raise another fund after that, and another fund after that, and I get to participate in all of these. Fantastic. I'm in, right? If I'm an individual investor or a family office, I love that deal. That deal is a danger for the studio. If you take too much dilution in that permanent holding company, you might, at some point, this range is usually between 30% dilution to 50% dilution in your studio, start looking at the other founders of the studio and going, this thing is really successful. Why is half of our returns going out to investors?
Yeah.
Let's hit reset. Investors don't want that to happen.
Yep.
So my advice, typically keep that ownership below 30% because that is a manageable number. Once that dilution,
the external ownership.
Yeah. Once you got more than half of your exits as a studio going out to investors, it's basically a certainty that you're going to fix this problem. And that's usually not good. So if I'm an investor, I want that permanent ownership. I love that. But it has to be managed well. And from the studio perspective, it's a permanent owner. Like, we all know how bad investors can be sometimes. That's a dangerous proposition often. The person that you're dealing with that represents that investor will change over time.
I think that's probably one of the reasons why we see a lot of these startup studios are, at least again, over the past decade, I feel like the majority that I've seen are people who have had exits, right? So traditional entrepreneurs, they made money and then they sold their company for 10 million to a billion. And then they say, okay, I want to start incubating companies, whatever term you want to use, a studio. And so they're starting with independent capital.
Yes.
And in that structure, you don't have external investors directly into the studio itself. So you're getting all the returns, you're building the full team. So it's interesting that now that it's opening up and the landscape shifting a bit to say, okay, well, startup studios, they're a thing. Like this is a good vehicle for investment, for incubation of companies, for building wealth. And I want to do it. I'm not that entrepreneur that sold a company for $100 million. So how do I do it? Well, I'm going to raise some money into the studio itself. This is where this kind of more nuance starts coming into play of saying, well, how much do you raise and who are these partners you want to bring on to the core level?
Well, and let's complicate it further. You don't have to raise. Raising for a studio is one of the most difficult things you'll ever do. So raising for a startup, okay, we know what we're building. We know the team. Okay, there's lots of groups that focus on this. Easy day. Raising for a venture fund, I can demonstrate deal flow, right? So I can demonstrate I can do the job of a venture capitalist, finding deal flow, giving you the best ones, like, hey, back me. How do I do this as a studio? I have to create new companies to demonstrate I can do this job without funding, without a full team, without a full playbook, without a full everything. That's really hard. That's just mind-blowingly difficult, right? Build a fund which is the studio, and build the operational structure of the studio. That's a full business and a half at least. And build 2 more businesses to demonstrate you can do this.
And have them do well.
This is like mind-blowingly difficult. People do it. Often what I will suggest is if you're thinking about going to raise, the bar you need to set for yourself is the reality check is, can you go email folks that you know and raise 75% of the funding you need? That funding, if you're in the US, is probably around 8 million. And the reason you're looking for probably 8 million is you got to build at least 3 companies that you can show good progress on, ideally getting one of them to Series A before you go raise for the next round of the studio, the next fund for the studio. If you only do 2 companies and one fails, that's not a good track record. If you do 3 and one fails, you still got 2. So you're all right. You're live, right? More than 3 is ideal because you need to have enough shots on goal to demonstrate you can do this job well. So most people can't do that, but there are other ways to start, and this is why I like the breadth of the studio world. Like, one of the frameworks I look at when I'm designing a studio is, okay, you've got a few folks coming together to be the founders of the studio. Every studio has to wear 3 hats. Studio is the entrepreneur, right? You're going to go find the opportunity. You're going to see through all these challenges and figure out how to do it. You're going to be the investor. You're going to put capital behind these ideas. You have to be a good steward of that money for your investors, even if it's just you. And then you've got to be the operator. You've got to build not just the companies, but the operational teams and structure within the studio. Most people don't have all those skill sets, and they definitely haven't mastered all of them. But whatever the strengths are in that founding team will likely lead you to a very specific starting point. If you're the investor, then you're going to go raise a fund because you know how to do that, right? If you're the founder or the entrepreneur, you're going to go, well, I can either raise for a portfolio company or I can raise for the fund because I know how to raise money and I know how to start stuff. So I'm going to go do that. If your strengths lie on the operating spectrum, the first thing you might do is like, let's build an operating company. Let's start making some money because I'm going to use this skill set and this structure within the studio anyway. In fact, if I look at a studio, I'm like, we've got a team that builds product. We've got maybe an HR team. We've got a sales team. We've got a marketing and branding team. All these look like operating agencies. Interesting.
Yep.
A couple of studios I know got their start by focusing on that path. And it's very liberating because it doesn't take a lot of capital to start. In fact, you can do it with no capital. And now you change your structure. Because if you're operating as an agency and the role of that agency is to make a profit, that is not a studio, right? Studio's business model is not making a profit off of selling services. You cannot operate a studio that way. It defeats the purpose, right? You're out of alignment with trying to build value in equity in a company. So you separate this. You have a studio over here, which you haven't really built yet, but you start by building an operating company. You take a piece of that profit and you put it back up into the top. That starts to fund the studio, funds the portfolio company that can turn around and pay those agencies full freight if you need to get those support or that support going into those portfolio companies. That model works. You don't need any capital to start it.
It's a cold jump start, but it does work.
It's also a different skill set. And so, if you know that this is a path that works and you really love the studio model, but you're that entrepreneur, maybe you're like, hey, maybe I should go recruit an operator to partner with, because that's the easier way to start than go raise this money and start building companies. That works well. There's a studio that did this in Dubai. I think Dubai. They started 11 years ago. They started with 3 partners, $1 million in capitalization between them. The first thing they built was a product development firm. They have not raised outside capital. 11 years later, their portfolio is worth $110 million.
Wow.
It's 110x. From a cold start. That's insane, right? That compares to the top venture funds in the world as far as return goes.
And again, if they did nothing today and they just kind of sat on that portfolio, I'm sure that the true potential would be even higher because they've just incubated and started new companies in the past year or so.
That's right. They don't need to go raise money. They can with that track record, no problem. But now you got a challenge like, how are you going to layer this in? Who owns what? It gets messy. But that's one of the things I kind of love about the studio model. There's so many ways to start. There's so many ways to build. You're really limited only by a few things. One is your imagination. How can you pull all these elements together in a way that will work? And understanding where the constraints are going to come in. And being real about what those constraints are, right? Investors want to see a certain thing. Deliver that. Or more. Don't under-deliver. Because when you under-deliver, like if you're that typical venture studio looking to feed into the venture capital funnel, if I design my whole studio with the purpose of each portfolio company going to raise a Series A, well, I built a return, assumptions into that. But if I can only mature those companies to the point where they could realistically raise a seed round, I got problems because that cap table is out of whack. So now I probably have to give up some of my equity as a studio to those VCs or somebody or back to the founders so that this works. Well, that hurts my returns. And now my investors are going, you promised, 90% IRR and we're only going to get 60 and we're not happy.
I think one of the things that this conversation has highlighted for me is the entrepreneur path is pretty, well, I shouldn't say straightforward, but it's there's a lot of messiness in figuring it out as you go, but it's a pretty linear path in the traditional sense, right? It's kind of have the idea, build it, try to just keep going, try to make it work, raise capital, just try to make it work. And then with the venture capital route, right, it's pretty straightforward. It's you raise a fund, 2 in 20, you invest, you do a couple funds, etc. But then with the startup studio or the studio world, it's very open. And there's a lot of different pathways, and some work and some don't. And some work if you do them in certain constructs and others don't. So it's the nature of what I'm kind of getting to is that there needs to be a lot more planning and thought that goes into starting a studio. Obviously, you need that for building a company and being an entrepreneur. Obviously, you need that if you're building a venture firm and fund. You need a thesis. But you need an extra amount of thinking through, 5 years out, the cap tables, the funds, like the follow-on funds, like how all of this works. And really, before you even start anything, you need to have a very clear plan across all elements for starting a studio.
It helps a lot, but that's a lot of work. And, for the entrepreneur, like, let me just start, right? That's what That's how we do
Go find my
things.
first customer, sell them something.
Yes, let's just start doing something. That is a recipe for disaster in some respects. Like if you get a fundamental thing wrong, that's going to be very painful to fix down the line. You can't find a single studio out there that hasn't had to change something rather fundamental as time has gone on. Like it's going to happen. It's okay. Don't let it stop you. But yeah, do a good sanity check. Make sure it's going to work for all your customers. Make sure it's going to work in your geography. Like some of the nuances I've seen are if you're doing a studio in like South America or Africa, for example, where you don't have a very mature venture capital market at the very top end, like the series C, D, and E and beyond, like that, it's not very well developed. Then the venture track might not be the right one to focus on. Focus on more private equity or M&A exits. That's much more potentially in that area developed, built up, and realistic. So you definitely have to adapt to the realities of the ecosystem that you're operating in. But there's a lot of flexibility. Like one of the unique studios I ran into here in Atlanta that's been shut down 20 years. Started in the 90s before the official studio model. All they did was they would build IT consulting companies. So their approach was they go to an executive at a large corporation, the IT person, VP of IT, and go, hey, you're not really respected here. Right? This is in the 90s. They don't care about software. Why don't you come on out? We got Y2K stuff going on. We got the startup boom going on. Like, let's do consulting. And they're like, I don't know how to do it. No problem. We're going to give you salary and health insurance for 18 months. We're going to make sure you can pay your bills. It's going to be a reduction from what you currently make, but we're your bank. We're going to help you build this company. Hugely successful. Their first portfolio company that they did 4 years in the 90s, was making $7.5 million a year in revenue, 50-60% margins. The studio pocketed that year distribution, 1.5. How much did it cost to start? $250,000 over 18 months? Maybe. Well, that's interesting. That's
where we start getting the crazy IRR.
That's right. That is venture level return building small businesses. And I look at that approach, I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. Because now I can do something like, what if I targeted a certain geography, a certain industry, a certain demographic? I can now have targeted economic development. That's interesting, right? If I want to drive impact, I'm in Atlanta. I go, hey, there's a couple areas of Atlanta that are very undeveloped. I'm going to look for people in these areas that are underrepresented, but have the right skill set. And I'm going to show up and teach them how to build their own consulting firm around that skill set. Massive game changer for them, their community, like everything. That's interesting. So there's so many ways,
Matt,
to build a studio.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could just like keep going for hours and hours. But like this world of studio, it's very nascent, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, yes, it's been around 20 years, but in terms of having terminology, people focusing on it, the shift away from venture or into alternative startup world investing, right? It's typically been venture or nothing else,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe a start-in or something. So maybe just to close us out, do you have any recommended resources for books or people to follow? Obviously, definitely, share, plug your LinkedIn. I know you have tons of great content that comes out, but if people are curious about this across any of the different customers, where should they go? What should they learn about, both for you and then also for just good reads?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple of great influencers out there that are writing solid content, creating solid content in the studio space. So a few shout outs. Jake Horowitz runs the gallery.tv. Fantastic. He was one of the original founders of the Global Startup Studio Network. He knows his stuff. Right. You've got Deanna, does the Startup Studio newsletter, does a lot of great content on the studios as well. Been very active in the space for longer than I have. Both Jake and Deanna have been around for a long time. Max Pog has started to do a lot of great YouTube videos, webinars, virtual studio conferences. He's done a great report as well. But if I'm an LP, one of the key resources I'm going to look at is anything that the Vault Fund publishes. So the Vault Fund is a studio-only fund of funds. The general partner behind it, Sarah Anderson, she has been investing in studios since 2015. She knows her stuff. Probably one of the most sophisticated investors in this space today. The content that they've put out, they've got several white papers, is just fantastic. In fact, based on the data set that they have, and you can imagine as an investor in studios, they get access to some pretty good data on studio performance. Their numbers that came out, I want to say November, October, end of 23, so fairly recent, 60% IRR. So not bad. So I definitely like the content that they put out because they do go into a lot of the nuance and a lot of the challenges of the studio model. And, you know, I write a lot about it on LinkedIn as well. And we'll be launching a podcast focused in this space in about a month or so. And the name is Studio Beat. We're going to dive into the ecosystem of each studio. So we'll talk to the studio, to portfolio companies, and optionally investors in the studio or portfolio companies, just to get a much better picture of how does this studio actually run. We can talk to the studio, but once you talk to the portfolio companies, the founders who've gone through that studio process, it changes things.
I will definitely be subscribing. And Matt, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's been fantastic as well. And I'm really curious from your perspective, because you've been an entrepreneur, right? You've built companies before. What do you think of the studio model? Would you go build a business with a studio? Would you go start a studio? How does this fit for you? Where does it bring?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always found that there's some VCs that are really great in my network, and so I've kind of, you know, I've talked a lot, and the ones I keep in touch with really generally drive tons of value. But I think that's not the typical use case. And so if I were to start a brand new company, I do think that the venture studio, the startup studio approach aligns incentives in a deeper and more meaningful way than traditional venture capital. And especially as, you know, if you're 18 or 22 and you're already eating ramen because you were just doing it in college, or you dropped out of college like I did, I think your appetite for risk is higher because you don't really have you don't have a mortgage, you don't have a partner, you don't have kids probably. So I think, you know, there's still a path for kind of the all-in craziness, and you can learn so much by going down that route. But the minute you're kind of further down the line, even though I do have all the experience around fundraising, of starting a company, about building a team, building technology, and I've kind of gone through that, I'm not necessarily on the corporate track and kind of need that kind of same level of support. Just having a more logical partner, a more thoughtful partner that's able to kind of be engaged actively and to support you, and then also offset your risk, right, in exchange for equity. Mm-hmm. But you're offsetting your risk to have that stable income. I definitely think I have a ton of friends who have gone to the startup studio route as entrepreneurs, and they love it. It's way less stress than traditional entrepreneurship, but you still get the exposure and upside that you do of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, there's a lot of benefits, and I think there's an interesting aspect that hasn't really been explored a lot. Imagine that studio 5 years later, still involved in the portfolio company at the board level. Maybe they have that independent board seat. They're in an interesting position because they often will own common stock and represent preferred stock. They're a really unique voice. They probably saw you build this thing from scratch. They know the industry really well. They know how venture works. And so, you know, I look at a voice like that on the board and like, I want that voice there to kind of be able to push back really well against well-meaning investors that just don't know this particular space, but also that can represent common stockholders, me as founder, right? They're a little bit more aligned with me than just an investor that has preferred equity that needs that exit. So it's an interesting voice to have later on, but it's really difficult for a studio to deliver that because your portfolio keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. So you get spread a little thin. But when you can deliver that, it's a really powerful voice to have there.
Yeah, different perspective, which is always at the end of the day what you want is you don't necessarily want any one voice to be too loud in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, thank you so much. This was fantastic. To be continued. We'll have to have you on again in 6 months.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.